Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be taking a close look at Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. This book, it kind of blew my mind a little bit. It really got me thinking about, how I make decisions.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, did you know, that we're way more motivated by the fear of losing something than we are by the thought of gaining something of the exact same value?
Yeah, that's loss aversion in action.
Exactly.
Kahneman's work it shows just how powerful our emotions really are when we make decisions. A lot of times we think we're being rational, but there's a lot going on under the surface.
Yeah, totally. And it all comes back to those two thinking systems he talks about. System one, that's the quick, intuitive one.
Yeah.
And then system two, the slower, more deliberate one. He uses this fascinating example, the invisible gorilla experiment, to show how easy it is to miss things, obvious things, when system one is calling the shots.
Oh yeah, that's a classic study. The people are so focused on counting the basketball passes in that video that they totally miss the guy in the gorilla suit just walking across the screen. It's amazing how selective our attention can be, right?
It really is.
Especially when system one is in overdrive.
And it just makes you wonder, how many other gorillas are we missing in everyday life, Especially when we're relying on those mental shortcuts Kahneman calls heuristics.
Well, they're efficient, sure, but they can also lead to some pretty predictable biases.
Yeah, that's the downside.
And that's why understanding those biases is so important. Like, take the anchoring effect, for instance. It shows how even a totally random piece of information can influence our judgments.
Oh, right, like that experiment where spinning a wheel of fortune. It actually influenced people's guesses about the percentage of African nations in the UN.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
like our brains get fixated on that first number, even if it's completely irrelevant.
So, knowing about this bias, how can we avoid falling for it, in real life?
Well, the first step is just being aware of it, especially in things like price negotiations, Realize you might be anchored to that initial number the other person throws out. And try to take a step back. Consider other information and challenge that anchor point.
So it's about engaging system two then, that more deliberate part of our thinking.
Exactly. But even system two has its limitations, right?
Oh, so it's not a foolproof system?
Not at all. It can be lazy, and sometimes it just accepts system one's quick judgments without really, thinking things through.
Oh, I see.
Like, think about that classic bat and ball problem. A bat and ball costs $1.10 total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost?
Oh, yeah, I've heard this one. 10 cents. Right.
Well, that's what system one wants you to think.
Uh-huh.
But if you actually do the math, the ball only costs 5 cents.
Oh, right. I always forget that.
Yeah, it's a great example of how our intuition can sometimes lead us astray.
Wow, so even with a simple problem like that, we can get tricked.
Exactly. It shows the power of those unconscious processes.
So what other biases should we be on the lookout for?
Well, priming is a fascinating one.
Priming.
Yeah, it shows how simply being exposed to a certain word or concept, it can subconsciously influence our thoughts and actions afterwards.
Really? So just hearing a word can change how we behave?
It can. Kahneman mentions this study where people were exposed to the phrase body temperature of a chicken, and they were more likely to just accept any random number as true.
Wow, that's a bit unsettling.
Yeah,
Well-
but it also explains a lot about how advertising works.
Oh, that's true.
They're constantly trying to prime us with those positive associations.
And then there's the availability heuristic, right?
Oh yes, that one's a biggie.
Which explains why we tend to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easy to recall or imagine.
Like plane crashes.
Yeah, plane crashes, shark attacks, things like that.
Exactly, things that get a lot of media attention.
It's like our brains create this highlight reel of those dramatic events, making them seem more common than they actually are.
Kahneman cites a study on risk perception that found people tend to overestimate the chances of dying from, say, accidents. But they underestimate the risks from less vivid causes, like diabetes.
So it's all about how easily we can picture something happening, not the actual statistics.
Right, and that's where being a critical consumer of information is crucial. Don't just rely on headlines or social media.
Yeah, easy to get sucked in.
Dig a little deeper, consult reputable sources, and try to get a balanced view.
So it's about being aware of that initial gut reaction that System 1 gives us.
Absolutely, and that's really a key message from Thinking Fast and Slow. It's not about getting rid of System 1. That's impossible.
We need it, right?
We do. It's about recognizing when it might be leading us astray and knowing when to engage that slower, more deliberate System 2.
So training our minds to be a bit more self-aware.
Exactly. and questioning those initial impulses.
Okay, so we've talked about these two systems battling it out in our minds. What happens when we start digging deeper into, like, the limitations of our own memories?
Ooh, now things get really interesting.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, Kahneman argues that our desire for a nice, neat, coherent story can actually lead us to believe we understand the past way better than we really do.
Oh, so we're kind of rewriting history to fit our current understanding.
Exactly. He calls this the hindsight bias.
It's like looking back on events and thinking, oh, that was so obvious, I should have seen it coming.
Right. But at the time, it wasn't obvious at all.
He uses the example of Nixon's visit to China and Russia.
Yeah, a great example. After the fact, people overestimated their ability to have predicted how things would turn out.
So even when we think we're being totally objective, we're still influenced by this bias.
Absolutely. We're always looking for patterns and creating stories, even when they might not really exist.
Wow, that's pretty profound.
And this can have real consequences for our decision-making, especially in areas like finance or politics.
Makes sense. We're always trying to predict the future based on what we think we know about the past.
Right. And it's a good reminder to be skeptical of those I knew it all along moments.
To question our own memories and interpretations.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got these two thinking systems duking it out, a tendency to rewrite history. What other mental quirks do we need to be aware of?
Well, Kahneman introduces this fascinating concept called prospect theory.
Okay, prospect theory.
Yeah, it basically challenges traditional economic models by considering the psychological factors at play.
So it's not just about, like, cold, hard calculation.
Right. It's about how we frame and experience potential gains and losses.
So it's not just the numbers themselves, but how we feel about those numbers.
Exactly.
I like that.
Prospect theory highlights three key principles that can help explain those seemingly irrational choices we sometimes make.
Okay, break it down for me. What are those three principles?
Well, first, we have loss aversion. You know, the idea that losses loom larger than gains.
We talked about that earlier, right?
Mhm.
Losing $100 feels worse than gaining $100 feels good.
Exactly. Then there's diminishing sensitivity. This means our sensitivity to both gains and losses, it decreases as the magnitude increases.
So, like, the difference between winning $100 and $200 feels more significant than the difference between winning $1,000 and $1,100.
Precisely. And finally, there's probability weighting, where we tend to overweight small probabilities and underweight large ones.
That explains why people play the lottery
Exactly. Even though the odds of winning are tiny.
and why we might not wear our seatbelts as often as we should.
Right. Even though the risk of an accident is much higher.
So, these principles can really mess with our ability to accurately assess risks.
They definitely can. And they help explain a wide range of behaviors, from consumer choices to investment decisions to public policy.
Wow, this is really making me rethink how I approach, well, just about everything. It's like we're peering into the inner workings of our own minds.
And seeing all those gears turning.
Okay, so we've got a better understanding of how our minds work, the biases, the heuristics, how we perceive gains and losses. But how does all of this affect our overall well-being?
Ah, great question. And that's where Kahneman introduces this idea of the two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self.
Two selves. Tell me more about that.
Well, the experiencing self is all about living in the present moment, right now, while the remembering self is responsible for storing and retrieving those memories.
And are you saying that these two selves, they don't always agree?
Often they don't. The remembering self tends to focus on the peak and end moments of an experience, often ignoring the duration or even the overall quality.
Kahneman describes this experiment where participants actually chose to repeat a longer, more painful experience simply because it had a less unpleasant ending.
Yeah, that's the cold hand experiment, a classic example of what he calls duration neglect and the peak end rule.
It's like we're creating a highlight reel of our lives, not the full, uncut film.
And that can lead to some interesting choices, right?
So, if we want to be truly happy, should we be chasing those peak moments?
That's a big question. And it's one that Kahneman explores throughout the book. It's not just about chasing peak experiences, it's about finding a balance between maximizing pleasure in the moment and creating a satisfying story of our lives.
So it's not just about how we feel right now, but also how we'll remember things later.
Exactly.
This is giving me a lot to think about.
It is, isn't it? We've just peeled back a few layers of this incredibly complex system, our minds.
So much more to uncover.
Absolutely.
Welcome back to our deep dive into thinking fast and slow. It's wild, we've been talking about all these mental shortcuts and biases, And I'm starting to see them everywhere now, even in my own decisions.
Yeah, it's eye-opening, isn't it?
It really is. We talked about anchoring, that availability heuristic, all those tricks System 1 uses to make those snap judgments.
And how those shortcuts, as efficient as they are, sometimes they lead us down the wrong path.
Exactly. But then we talked about how System 2, the more deliberate system, it's not always strong enough to override those quick judgments.
Yeah. System 2, it can be pretty lazy.
It's like it just takes the easy way out,
Accepts whatever System 1 throws at it.
without really thinking things through.
Yeah.
So it's like this constant tug of war between the two.
A great way to put it. And the key is, I think, understanding that dynamic, knowing when to trust your gut and when to, pump the brakes and really analyze things.
That makes sense. One thing that really stuck with me was that illusion of validity, where we can feel so confident in our judgments, even when we're dead wrong.
Oh yeah, that's a powerful one. Kahneman talks about his own experience. As a military psychologist, he and his team, they were convinced they could predict which soldier candidates would succeed just based on, short interviews and some exercises.
But their predictions were basically random.
Barely better than chance.
Yeah.
And yet, they still felt like they were experts.
It's like our brains trick us into believing we know more than we do.
Exactly. And that illusion of expertise, it's everywhere,
Mhm.
especially in fields like finance or politics, where people make these bold predictions about the future.
But as we talked about, sometimes even the most complex algorithms, they don't do much better than simple models.
Predicting the future, it's a tough business.
So are you saying we should just give up on trying to predict anything?
No, not necessarily. It's about being aware of the limits of our own knowledge and not assuming that, just because something worked in the past, it guarantees success in the future.
It's a good reminder to stay humble.
Yeah, and to remember that luck plays a role too.
That's a good point. Speaking of experts being wrong, Kahneman talks about that hindsight bias,
Oh yes, that one's a classic.
where we look back and think, oh, of course that happened. It was so obvious.
It's like we're constantly rewriting history to fit our current beliefs.
Exactly. He uses that example of Nixon visiting China and Russia.
Right, and afterwards, everyone thought they knew it was going to happen all along.
But at the time, it was a pretty big surprise.
Yeah, a huge gamble actually. The hindsight bias, it really shows how much our minds crave those neat narratives.
Even if those narratives aren't, completely accurate.
Exactly. And that can be dangerous, especially when it comes to making decisions based on those flawed memories.
It's a good reminder to be skeptical of our own interpretations of the past.
To question those I knew it all along moments.
Okay, so we've got these two systems battling it out, the hindsight bias messing with our memories. What else? What other mental quirks do we need to watch out for?
Well, there's this fascinating concept Kahneman calls prospect theory.
Prospect theory. What's that all about?
It basically challenges, those traditional economic models that assume people are perfectly rational. Prospect theory says, nope, there's a lot more psychology going on here.
So it's not just about, crunching the numbers and weighing the odds.
Right. It takes into account how we actually feel about those gains and losses.
So our emotions play a big role.
A huge role. Prospect theory highlights 3 key principles that can help explain why we sometimes make choices that, on the surface, seem irrational.
Okay, I'm all ears. Lay it on me. What are those 3 principles?
First up, you guessed it, loss aversion. Remember, losses hurt more than gains feel good.
We talked about that. Losing $100 stings way more than finding $100 feels good.
Exactly. Then there's diminishing sensitivity. The idea that, our sensitivity to gains and losses, it decreases as the amounts get bigger.
So, the difference between winning $100 and $200 feels more significant than the difference between winning $1,000 and $1,100, even though it's the same amount.
Precisely. And finally, we have probability weighting. We tend to overestimate those small probabilities and underestimate the big ones.
Ah, so that explains the lottery thing.
Yep. People buy those tickets, even though the odds of winning are astronomically small.
And it explains why we might not worry as much about, say, getting into a car accident.
Even though it's statistically much more likely than, winning the mega millions.
It's like our brains just aren't very good at processing those probabilities.
Not intuitively, no. And that can have a big impact on how we assess risk and make decisions.
So these 3 principles, they can really throw a wrench in our attempts to be rational.
They can. But by understanding them, we can start to recognize those patterns in our own thinking.
And maybe even make better choices.
Exactly. Prospect theory, It's a powerful tool for understanding human behavior.
This is blowing my mind. It's like we're getting this behind the scenes look at how our minds actually work.
It is pretty amazing, isn't it? All these complex processes happening under the surface.
Okay, so we've got a better grasp of the two systems, the biases, how we perceive those gains and losses. But what does this all mean for our happiness and well-being?
The big question. And that's where Kahneman introduces this really interesting idea. The two selves. The experiencing self and the remembering self.
Two selves. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, the experiencing self, that's the one living in the present moment, right here, right now. The remembering self, that's the one that stores and retrieves those memories of our experiences.
And you're saying these two selves, they don't always see eye to eye?
Not always. The remembering self, it has a funny way of prioritizing certain moments.
Like those peak moments and the ending.
Exactly. It often ignores how long an experience lasted, or even how we felt during most of it.
Kahneman talks about that experiment where people chose to repeat a longer, more painful experience just because it had a less unpleasant ending.
Yeah, that's the cold hand experiment, a classic example of what he calls duration neglect and the peak end rule.
So it's like we're judging an entire movie based on the last scene.
Kind of. It shows how our memories are shaped by those salient moments, those peaks and endings.
But that doesn't always reflect the whole picture, right?
Right. And that can have implications for how we make choices about our lives.
So if we want to be truly happy, should we just be focusing on those peak moments?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer. It's about finding that balance between enjoying the moment and crafting a life story that feels satisfying in retrospect.
A story that reflects the full experience, not just the highlights.
Exactly. And that's something to keep in mind as we continue our exploration of thinking fast and slow.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? Two thinking systems, all those sneaky biases, and how we wrestle with gains and losses.
It's been quite a journey, but we're not done yet. Today, we're tackling one of the most powerful forces in decision-making.
Oh, more powerful than loss aversion.
It might be. We're talking about framing.
Framing, like putting a picture in a frame.
In a way, yes. It's how the way choices are presented, the words used, the context, it can all drastically change our decisions, even when the options are basically the same.
So it's not just what we're choosing, it's how it's shown to us.
Exactly. Kahneman and his colleague Amos Tversky, they did some fascinating experiments on this. One famous one is the Asian disease problem.
The Asian disease problem. Okay, that sounds a bit intense.
It is. Imagine there's this deadly outbreak. You have to choose between two programs to fight it, but they're described differently.
Okay, so two programs, but different descriptions. I'm following.
In one version, it's all about lives saved. Program A, it guarantees 200 people will be saved. Program B, there's a 33% chance of saving all 600 people, but a 67% chance of saving no one.
So A is a sure thing, but smaller. B is a gamble, could be amazing, or a total loss.
Exactly. Now imagine the same programs, but framed in terms of lives lost.
Okay, so now it's about how many might die.
Right. Program C, same as A, it says 400 people will die. Program D, same as B, 33% chance no one dies, 67% chance all 600 die.
So it's the same choices, just worded as saving or losing lives. Did it make a difference?
A huge difference. When it was about lives saved, people chose Program A, the sure thing. But when it was about lives lost, they went for Program D, the gamble.
Wow, so just changing the words flipped their preferences? That's incredible.
It shows how loss aversion, that fear of losing, it really pushes us around, depending on how things are framed.
So it's like framing is another bias layered on top of everything else.
You could say that, and it's everywhere. You know, healthcare, finance, marketing, it's how they get you.
Yeah, I can see that. A doctor saying this surgery has a 10% mortality rate versus it has a 90% survival rate. Same thing, but way different feeling.
Exactly. And it makes you realize how easily we can be swayed even when we think we're being totally logical.
So what can we do about it? Just be aware of framing and hope for the best.
Awareness is a big step. Recognize when someone might be using framing to nudge you in a certain direction.
Like those ads that say 9 out of 10 dentists recommend. Makes it sound like everyone's on board.
Exactly. But also, we can use framing to our advantage. Think about organ donation programs.
Oh, yeah.
Many have a default option where you're an organ donor unless you opt out. It's framed to encourage donation. And it works.
Wow, that's pretty clever.
It is. And that's the beauty of all this, you know? Thinking fast and slow. It's not just a theory book.
It's like a user manual for our brains.
I like that. It gives us practical tools to understand those quirks and make better choices.
Well, I know I've learned a ton from this deep dive. A huge thanks to expert speaker for walking us through it all.
The pleasure was all mine. These ideas, they're so fascinating, they just get you thinking, don't they?
They really do. And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us on this exploration of thinking fast and slow. Hopefully, you've gained some insights into the amazing, sometimes baffling ways our minds work. We've learned about the two systems, the biases, those mental shortcuts, how we frame things, and so much more. It's a lot to take in, but remember, the more we understand these processes, the better equipped we are to make good choices, navigate this crazy world, and maybe even be a bit happier along the way. So keep those minds sharp, keep questioning, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.